February 1934. Huntsville, Texas. The sun had not risen yet. Inside the execution wing of the prison in Huntsville, the air was cold, heavy, and unnaturally quiet. Guards moved slowly, speaking in whispers, their boots echoing softly against concrete floors polished by decades of footsteps. This was not an ordinary execution morning. This was different. For the first time in Texas history, a woman was scheduled to die. Her name was Margaret Hale. She was 47 years old. A mother. A former wife. A woman most people had never heard of until now. 60 official witnesses had already gathered behind the glass. Doctors. Prison officials. State representatives. A handful of reporters who would later struggle to describe what they saw without shaking. No one joked. No one smiled. Even men who had witnessed executions before felt something was wrong. They just didn't know how wrong. Margaret was led down the corridor just after 5 a.m. She walked on her own. No dragging. No resistance. No tears. Witnesses later said her face looked calm, almost peaceful, as if she were walking into a courthouse instead of an execution chamber. She wore a plain dress. Her hair was neatly pinned. Her hands were steady. One guard would later say she looked like she had already made peace with whatever was coming. That alone unsettled everyone in the room. Because this was Texas. And executions here were never gentle. Before the final preparations began, the room fell silent. You could hear breathing. You could hear the ticking of a wall clock. And then, Margaret turned her head slightly. She looked toward the witnesses. Not angry. Not afraid. Just curious. As if she wanted to know who would remember her. If you're watching this right now, take a moment, because this is where the story begins to tighten. If you're drawn to stories that feel real, stories that reveal what history tried to bury, subscribe to this channel now. These aren't just stories. They're questions that never got answered. Margaret was positioned carefully. Officials double-checked the equipment. They had practiced this. Rehearsed it. They believed they were prepared. But one miscalculation, just one, would turn this moment into something Texas would regret for generations. The order was given. The mechanism was activated. And within seconds, something went horribly wrong. Not a scream. Not chaos. Just shock. A silence so deep it felt unreal. Several witnesses froze in place. Others turned away instinctively, hands flying to their mouths. One woman fainted. Another reportedly whispered, "Oh God, no." What happened inside that chamber would never be officially described in detail by the state. But word spread fast. By noon, newspapers across Texas were already rewriting headlines. By the next morning, the rest of the country knew. Texas had executed its first woman. And it had gone catastrophically wrong. But here's the part that still disturbs people to this day. Margaret Hale did not die screaming. She did not fight. She did not confess. She walked calmly to her death and took something with her that the state would never recover. The truth. Because outside that prison, miles away, her family was waking up to headlines they couldn't understand. Her children. Her relatives. People who had known her as a quiet Texas woman. They would ask the same question for decades. Why was she really executed? Because what the public believed. What the court decided. And what actually happened. Those were not the same thing. And that's why you should stay with me. Because what happened before this morning, the marriages, the deaths, the investigation, and the evidence that quietly disappeared, is far more disturbing than what happened inside that execution chamber. And once you hear it, you'll understand why some stories never truly end. Stay with me. Because what happened before this morning is even more disturbing. And before we continue, tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from right now? Texas? California? Somewhere else? Your answers matter. Long before her name ever appeared in Texas newspapers. Long before prison walls and witnesses. Margaret Hale was invisible. And that's important. Because people rarely suspect women they barely notice. Margaret was born in 1887, just outside Waco, in a small rural community where everyone knew your face but not your secrets. Her childhood was unremarkable in every way that mattered. No scandals. No violence. No stories neighbors whispered about years later. She grew up the way many Texas women did at the time. Early mornings. Hard work. Sunday church without exception. She learned to cook before she learned to dream. Learned to keep quiet before she learned to speak her mind. People who remembered her later would say the same thing again and again. She was polite. She minded her business. She wasn't the kind of woman you worried about. Margaret married young, as expected. Her husband, Thomas Hale, worked steady jobs, nothing glamorous, but reliable. Together they had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and settled into a small rented home on the edge of town. Life followed a predictable rhythm. Weekdays were for work. Sundays were for church. Evenings were for family dinners and quiet conversations. Margaret was known as a devoted mother. The kind who packed lunches carefully, who showed up on time, who never raised her voice in public. She volunteered at church events, helped other women when she could, and avoided gossip. If you had asked anyone back then to describe her, no one would have used the word dangerous. Or even strange. She blended in perfectly. And that's why what came next was so unsettling. In the winter of 1926, Thomas Hale fell ill. Nothing dramatic at first. Fatigue. Loss of appetite. A cough that wouldn't go away. Doctors visited the house. They wrote notes. They shrugged. Medical care in Texas back then was simple. If a man weakened quickly, people accepted it. There were no extensive tests. No questions that lingered too long. Within weeks, Thomas was dead. The cause? Natural illness. No autopsy. No investigation. Margaret mourned quietly. She dressed in black. She attended the funeral without incident. She returned home with 2 children who suddenly depended on her for everything. Neighbors brought food. Church members offered prayers. And slowly, life moved on. But something had shifted. Not outwardly. Not yet. Margaret worked harder. Took on small jobs. Did laundry for other families. She did what widows were expected to do, survive without complaint. 2 years later, she remarried. Some thought it was too soon. Others said it made sense. A woman alone in Texas had limited choices, especially with children to raise. Her second husband was quieter. Older. Less involved with the community. And then, he died too. Suddenly. Again, doctors found no clear cause. Again, there was no autopsy. Again, the coffin was closed. This time, people noticed. Not accusations. Just looks. The kind of looks you feel on your back. Margaret noticed them too. She stopped lingering after church. Stopped visiting neighbors as often. Kept her head down. If you're watching closely, this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because nothing illegal had happened. No crime. No proof. Just loss. And loss, repeated often enough, makes people uneasy. Margaret never defended herself. Never explained. Never accused anyone of doubting her. She simply did what many Texans would do when a town starts to feel smaller than it should. She left. But before she did, something inside her changed. A quiet urgency. A sense that staying meant being judged forever. She packed up her children's belongings, folded away the dresses she wore to church, and told friends she was starting over. No one stopped her. No one warned her. No one imagined that this quiet woman, this mother, this widow, was stepping onto a path that would eventually lead to a Texas execution chamber. And that's the part that still disturbs people today. Because when Margaret Hale disappeared from that town, she wasn't running from justice. She was running from suspicion. And sometimes, that's where the real trouble begins. Then the first man in her life died. And nothing was ever the same again. At first, no one said anything out loud. That's how it usually begins. In small Texas towns, people don't accuse, they observe. They notice patterns. They store details away. They let silence do the talking. After Thomas Hale's death, Margaret had been treated with sympathy. After her second husband died, that sympathy changed into something harder to define. Not anger. Not fear. Suspicion. Both men had died quietly, in their own beds. No signs of struggle. No obvious illness anyone could point to with certainty. Doctors wrote the same words both times. Natural causes. And in 1920s Texas, that was usually the end of it. No autopsies. No toxicology tests. No follow-up questions. Death was accepted as part of life, especially when it happened behind closed doors. But communities have long memories. 2 husbands. 2 sudden deaths. Same woman left behind. People began to connect dots they couldn't prove. At church, conversations lowered when Margaret walked past. At the general store, people paused just a second longer than necessary before responding to her. She felt it. You always do. Margaret noticed the way eyes followed her as she crossed the street. The way neighbors suddenly remembered something else they needed to do when she approached. The way kindness turned stiff, rehearsed, uncomfortable. No one confronted her. No one asked questions directly. But judgment doesn't need words to be loud. What made it worse was how ordinary everything looked on the surface. Margaret still attended church. Still dressed modestly. Still raised her children carefully. There were no scenes. No breakdowns. No visible cracks. And that made people even more uneasy. Because when tragedy strikes once, it's misfortune. When it strikes twice, people start wondering why. Behind closed doors, whispers grew. Some said Margaret brought bad luck. Others said she married weak men. A few quietly wondered if she knew more than she let on. There was no evidence to support any of it. But suspicion doesn't wait for proof. It feeds on absence. On unanswered questions. On what wasn't examined. Margaret became aware of how carefully people watched her children, too. How conversation stopped when they entered rooms. How invitations slowly disappeared. It was subtle, but relentless. If you're listening closely, this is the moment where many lives quietly unravel. Not because of guilt, but because of isolation. Margaret began spending less time outside. She avoided gatherings. She stopped explaining herself, because explaining only seemed to make things worse. And here's something that often gets overlooked in stories like this. She was still grieving. 2 husbands. 2 sudden losses. 2 lives ended without warning. But grief wasn't what people saw when they looked at her. They saw a pattern. And patterns make people uncomfortable. So let me ask you something, and really think about it before you answer. Do you think coincidence exists here? Comment yes or no below. Because your answer says a lot about how you see this story. Margaret never asked herself that question out loud. She didn't need to. She already knew how the town had answered it. And once a place decides who you are, it rarely changes its mind. Margaret began to understand that staying meant being watched forever. That every cough, every illness, every accident around her would be measured against her past. So she made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not a desperate one. A practical one. She would leave. Not to escape justice, there was none chasing her. But to escape judgment. So Margaret did what many Texans would do when a place no longer feels safe. She left. After leaving her hometown, Margaret Hale sought a fresh start. She wanted quiet. Stability. A life where no one judged her for the tragedies that had followed her. Her path led her to a sprawling cattle ranch just outside San Antonio. It was beautiful, isolated, and exactly the kind of place where someone could disappear if they wished. The ranch belonged to Henry Caldwell, a man in his late 60s. Stern. Wealthy. Used to getting what he wanted. Most people described him as precise, meticulous, sometimes abrasive. But he needed a caretaker, and Margaret needed work. At first, it seemed perfect. She cooked, cleaned, and maintained the large property. Henry paid well, offered room and board, and rarely interfered. But isolation changes people. And tension grows in quiet places where 2 strong personalities share the same roof. Henry was demanding. Margaret was meticulous. Neither knew how to bend. Arguments started small. A misplaced tool. A meal not cooked to his exacting standards. Then words became sharper. Tone became clipped. Doors slammed. Neighbors later reported seeing Margaret leaving the ranch late at night, only to return silently in the early hours. But no one ever saw what happened inside the house. Money became a point of friction. Margaret occasionally bought supplies on her own, reimbursing herself from Henry's funds. He criticized her for spending too much. She resented the constant surveillance. Their interactions escalated behind closed doors. Visitors noticed nothing, just a calm house on the outside. But inside, the tension was palpable. 2 people from entirely different worlds trying to survive under one roof, with money, age, and power imbalance threatening to tear them apart. And then, one morning in November 1932, the impossible happened. Henry Caldwell vanished. No note. No goodbye. No sign of struggle. The ranch stood silent, the doors locked, the animals fed, yet Henry, gone. Then one morning, Henry Caldwell vanished. When the disappearance was reported, the Texas Rangers were called in immediately. They combed the ranch for clues. Nothing. No blood. No signs of forced entry. No indications Henry had left voluntarily. Even the animals seemed unaware of anything unusual. The only evidence, Henry's truck, missing. Weeks later, it turned up near El Paso, sold under a false name. Margaret Hale was arrested in Dallas, staying in a modest hotel under an assumed identity. At first, she was not charged with murder. Instead, authorities charged her with theft of property, Henry's truck and belongings. But the press didn't wait for proof. Headlines blared across Texas. Black Widow strikes again. Mystery woman of San Antonio ranch vanishes with elderly man's property. Suddenly, Margaret's name was known in every county. She was the subject of gossip, fear, and speculation. Yet even with the arrests and sensational headlines, there was one problem that kept haunting the investigation. There was no body. No Henry Caldwell. No sign of a crime that could explain his disappearance. Investigators had a suspect. They had a motive. But without a body, they had nothing conclusive. And that was when the story took on a life of its own. If you're following the story so far, subscribe, because this is where it turns dark, and what happens next will shock you. But Texas still had a problem. There was no body. Months passed. The Texas Rangers were frustrated. They had a suspect. They had a motive. But they still didn't have a body. Every lead had gone cold. Every tip had faded into nothing. Then, in the dry summer of 1933, something unexpected happened. A ranch hand named Samuel Trask, digging a new well on the outskirts of the Caldwell property, hit something solid. At first, he thought it was a rock. But as he dug deeper, his shovel struck bone. Samuel froze. His heart raced. He backed away. Then, trembling, he ran to the nearest town to report it. When the Rangers arrived, they discovered a shallow grave, partially hidden under dry brush. The soil had been disturbed recently, enough to suggest someone had tried to cover it hastily. Inside lay the remains of Henry Caldwell. There was no need for graphic details to understand the horror. His skull had obvious blunt force trauma. His body had been buried carelessly, almost as if the perpetrator had been in a hurry. For Texas investigators, this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Suddenly, everything flipped. The theft charges were insignificant now. Margaret Hale, already under scrutiny for her previous suspicious circumstances, was now the prime suspect in a capital murder case. The newspapers exploded with headlines. Black Widow confirmed. Ranch hand uncovers grim secret. Texas shocked. What had seemed like a crime of property theft transformed overnight into a murder investigation. The community that had been whispering about Margaret now demanded justice. The authorities could no longer delay. Investigators reviewed her past. 2 deceased husbands. Insurance policies she had taken out. Sudden disappearances. Patterns became evidence. Patterns became suspicion. Margaret was brought back to the Caldwell Ranch under heavy guard. She refused to speak beyond stating the basics. Her calm demeanor unnerved everyone. When the sheriff asked if she had anything to say, she simply shook her head and replied, "I have already said what I can." And now, for the first time, the stakes were unmistakable. Texas wanted the ultimate punishment. The wheels of the justice system began to turn. A trial would follow. A jury would decide her fate. But the question on everyone's mind was the same. Did Margaret Hale commit the unthinkable? Or had the combination of circumstance, suspicion, and rumor finally caught up with a woman who had survived too much already? And now, Texas wanted the ultimate punishment. The trial of Margaret Hale began in the spring of 1934 inside a packed courtroom in Austin. People lined up before dawn just to get a seat. This wasn't just a murder trial. This was a spectacle. Newspapers had already decided who Margaret was. Radio hosts spoke her name with certainty. Strangers argued about her guilt in barbershops and cafes across Texas. By the time the judge entered the room, the jury was already under pressure. Margaret sat quietly at the defense table, dressed plainly, hands folded in her lap. She did not look like the monster the headlines had created. She looked tired. Smaller than before. Almost fragile. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted a picture of a woman who profited from death. One by one, they introduced insurance documents. Policies taken out on her first husband. Then her second. And finally, Henry Caldwell. Each policy was legal. Each one was signed openly. But when laid side by side, they formed a pattern the jury could not ignore. 3 men. 3 deaths. 1 woman who walked away alive and financially secure. The courtroom murmured. Then came the character attacks. The prosecutor described Margaret as cold, calculating, and deceptive. They suggested she moved through men like stepping stones. That she knew how to appear gentle while hiding something darker beneath the surface. Witnesses testified about her quiet nature. But instead of presenting it as modesty, the prosecution twisted it into something else. She was secretive. She kept to herself. She never showed much emotion. Everything that once made Margaret invisible was now being used against her. When it was time for the defense, the room grew tense. Margaret took the stand. Her voice was steady, but soft. She described life on the ranch. Henry Caldwell's temper. The arguments. The fear she felt when he became angry. She claimed that on the night he died, Henry attacked her during an argument over money. That she struck him in self-defense. That panic, not malice, drove her actions afterward. She admitted burying the body. But she denied planning his death. Some jurors leaned forward. Others looked away. The prosecution dismantled her story piece by piece. Why didn't she report the incident? Why did she flee? Why sell his truck under a false name? Margaret had no answers that satisfied them. Fear filled the room. Not just fear of crime, but fear of being wrong. Fear that if they believed her, they might be letting a killer walk free. Fear that if they didn't, they might be condemning an innocent woman. The judge sent the jury to deliberate. The courtroom waited. And waited. But not for long. If you were on that jury, would you believe her? Comment below. Guilty or self-defense? The verdict came faster than anyone expected. Years passed. Margaret Hale's name faded from headlines, but it never fully disappeared. In Texas, some stories don't end, they wait. It wasn't until the late 1940s, long after the trial, that something unsettling surfaced inside a county records office in Harris County. A junior clerk, reviewing old capital case files, noticed gaps. Pages missing. Signatures scratched out. Witness statements referenced, but not included. At first, it looked like clerical error. But the deeper the clerk searched, the stranger it became. Several witness interviews from the Caldwell Ranch investigation were gone. Ranch neighbors who had once spoken about Henry Caldwell's temper were no longer on record. One document referenced a prior assault charge against Henry in another Texas county, but the charge itself was missing. It was as if pieces of the case had been quietly erased. Then came the most disturbing discovery. A medical report from years before Margaret ever met Henry Caldwell described him as violent when intoxicated. The report existed, but it had never been presented to the jury. Neither had testimony from a former ranch worker who claimed Henry had threatened him with a firearm during an argument. That testimony was referenced, but never filed. No one could explain when the files vanished, or who removed them, or why. There was no accusation made publicly, no reopened trial, no official admission of error, just silence. And by then, silence was all Texas had left to offer. Because by the time these missing files came to light, Margaret Hale was already dead. We return now to that morning. Before sunrise, inside the Texas execution chamber, Margaret walked calmly. Witnesses later said she showed no resistance, no panic, just a quiet resignation that unsettled everyone in the room. She was strapped in place. Prayers were whispered. A chaplain stood nearby. Officials checked their watches. This was supposed to be routine. But executions are never routine. When the mechanism was activated, something went horribly wrong. The calculations were off. The moment unfolded faster than anyone expected, and in a way no one had prepared for. Margaret was beheaded. The room erupted. Several witnesses fainted. One official screamed. Others rushed forward in shock and disbelief. The execution was halted immediately, but it was already too late. Word spread quickly beyond the prison walls. By noon, newspapers across the United States were running emergency editions. Radio stations broke into regular programming. The nation reacted in horror. Texas had executed its first woman, and the execution had gone catastrophically wrong. Public outrage followed. Questions flooded in from New York City, Los Angeles, and even overseas. How could this happen? Why was she executed this way? And most haunting of all, what if the truth had never been fully told? Like this video if this moment shocked you, because Texas was never the same again. After Margaret Hale's execution, Texas moved quickly to do what institutions often do best. It changed procedures. Execution protocols were reviewed. Calculations were rewritten. Officials promised that what happened that morning would never happen again. And in a technical sense, they were right. But when it came to Margaret Hale herself, the woman at the center of it all, Texas went silent. There was no apology. No public statement acknowledging error. No admission that the execution had gone wrong. No explanation for the missing files. Her case was never reopened. For the state, the matter was considered closed. For Margaret's family, it never was. In the years that followed, her remaining relatives spoke quietly, never to major newspapers, never on the radio. They believed Margaret had been judged more for who she was than for what had been proven. A woman. Poor. Twice widowed. Alone. They believed fear had filled the gaps where evidence should have been. They believed the jury convicted a pattern, not a crime. They believed the state executed a woman before the full truth ever surfaced. And they believed that if those missing files had been shown in court, the verdict might have been different. But belief does not change history. Margaret Hale's name remains etched into Texas records, not as a mystery resolved, but as a question unanswered. Was she guilty of murder? Or was she a woman crushed under suspicion, silence, and a system that needed certainty more than truth? That question still divides people today. Some say justice was served. Others say it was rushed. And many admit they simply don't know. And maybe that's the most disturbing part of all. Because the most haunting stories aren't the ones with clear villains. They're the ones where we are forced to ask ourselves what we would have decided, with the same fear, the same pressure, and the same incomplete truth. If you want more stories they don't teach you, subscribe to this channel. If justice matters to you, share this video. And tell me in the comments below. Guilty or wrongfully executed? Because Texas may have closed the case. But the question never left.